On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 14, Prayers in the Night. The narrow alleyways of St. Louis seemed to stretch endlessly before Dusty, twisting and turning like a maze designed to trap the unwary. The shadows clung to the buildings like dark curtains, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Dusty moved quickly but carefully, his footsteps muffled against the rain-soaked pavement. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and the faint odor of garbage that had been left to rot in the corners of forgotten streets. He had been tracking Jackson's men for hours, slipping through the darkened streets, trying to stay one step ahead of them. The information he had gotten from Miles was solid, but it had come at a cost. The blood on his hands, Miles's blood, was still fresh in his memory, a grim reminder that he was racing against time. Jackson was tightening his grip, and Dusty knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. The night was cold and unforgiving, a sharp contrast to the heat of the pursuit that raged inside Dusty. His body was tense, every muscle coiled, ready for the fight he knew was coming. His breath came in short bursts, his pulse thrumming in his ears as he moved through the darkness, his mind sharp, focused. But something lingered at the edges of his consciousness, something he couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. It was the feeling he'd had for weeks now, an almost tangible presence that seemed to hover just out of sight. He had been saved too many times, escaped too many near deaths for it to be coincidence. It gnawed at him, a question he wasn't ready to answer but couldn't push away any longer. As he rounded another corner, the faint glow of a street lamp flickered in the distance, casting a pale circle of light on the wet pavement. Dusty slowed, his senses on high alert. He knew he was getting close. The last tip had led him to this part of the city, a place where Jackson's men had been spotted more than once. It was here that the heart of Jackson's operation beat, hidden in the shadows where few dared to venture. Dusty's breath caught as he saw them, two men standing beneath the flickering street lamp, their backs turned to him. They were talking in low voices, their postures relaxed but alert. Dusty crouched low, keeping to the shadows as he watched them. His hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He needed to listen, needed to be sure this was the right move. The men didn't notice him, too caught up in their conversation to realize they were being watched. Dusty inched closer, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Every sense was heightened, every muscle in his body tense as he strained to hear their words. "Boss says we move tomorrow," one of the men muttered, his voice rough. "Says the girl's more trouble than she's worth. Might be time to get rid of her." Dusty's blood ran cold. The girl, Mila. His breath quickened, but he forced himself to stay still, his mind racing. They were talking about her, the little girl who had been missing for days, the little girl who had become more than just a case to him. Mila was out there, somewhere close, and they were planning to dispose of her. Dusty's jaw clenched, anger burning through him like a wildfire. He had to act, and he had to act now. He moved silently, slipping through the shadows, closer to the men. His hand tightened around the gun at his side, but just as he was about to make his move, a sound behind him froze him in place. The unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Dusty's heart slammed into his ribs as he slowly raised his hands. Again? His breath coming in shallow gasps. He hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't sensed the danger until it was too late. His pulse quickened as he turned his head slightly, just enough to see the man standing behind him, the barrel of a gun aimed squarely at his back. "Don't move," the man growled, his voice low and menacing. Dusty's mind raced, trying to assess the situation. He was trapped, pinned between the two men in front of him and the gunman behind him. His body tensed, ready to fight, but he knew he couldn't make a move without risking everything. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat echoing in the silence that followed. The two men under the street lamp had stopped talking, their heads snapping toward Dusty as they realized he had been watching them. One of them, a tall, burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," he sneered. "Look who we've got here. The great Dusty Rhymes, sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." Dusty's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he met the man's gaze. "Let the girl go," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and dangerous. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent a chill down Dusty's spine. "You're in no position to make demands," he said, his smile widening. "But don't worry, you won't be around to see what happens next." Dusty's breath came in sharp gasps as he struggled to think, to find a way out. The gun at his back was a constant reminder that one wrong move could end everything. His mind raced, searching for an opening, but the odds were stacked against him. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely exposed. And then, just as the man in front of him raised his gun, something happened. A sudden, inexplicable gust of wind tore through the alley, howling like a living thing. Dusty's heart skipped a beat as the street lamp above them flickered violently before going out, plunging the alley into darkness. The gunman behind him cursed, momentarily disoriented, and in that split second, Dusty moved. He ducked low, his body moving on instinct as he spun around, knocking the gunman's arm aside. The shot rang out, the sound deafening in the narrow alley, but it missed, ricocheting off the brick wall. Dusty didn't hesitate. He surged forward, his body a blur of motion as he disarmed the man with a swift, practiced movement, sending him crashing to the ground. The other two men reacted too slowly, their surprise giving Dusty the advantage he needed. He turned, drawing his own gun in one fluid motion and aiming it squarely at the man with the scar. The man froze, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the alley was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the men around him. Dusty's heart pounded in his chest, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. That wind, the sudden darkness. It had been more than luck. It had been something else, something he couldn't explain. He glanced up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the clouds, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, someone had been watching over him. "Drop the gun," Dusty ordered, his voice cold and hard. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to his fallen comrades, but he knew better than to fight. With a scowl, he dropped the gun to the ground, raising his hands in surrender. Dusty kept his weapon trained on them, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he fought to steady himself. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but beneath it all, there was a quiet realization that gnawed at him. A realization that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. He had been saved. Again. Dusty's jaw clenched as he thought about the prayers that Pastor Ethan had mentioned, the prayers from people like Roxy, Megan, and others who had been silently hoping for his safety. He had dismissed them, pushed them aside as little more than wishful thinking. But now he wasn't so sure. His grip tightened around his gun as he glanced at the men on the ground, the danger not entirely gone but held at bay for the moment. "Where's Mila?" Dusty demanded, his voice low and filled with barely contained rage. The man with the scar sneered, but there was fear in his eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty. "You're too late," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "She won't be alive much longer." Dusty's heart lurched, but he didn't let the fear show. He couldn't. He had to stay in control, had to stay focused. "You're lying," Dusty said coldly. "Tell me where she is, or you'll regret it." The man hesitated for a moment longer, his bravado fading as the cold reality of Dusty's threat settled in. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's at the old shipping yard," he muttered. "South end of town." Dusty's heart raced. He had a lead, but he knew time was running out. Without another word, he turned and ran, leaving the men behind in the darkness. The wind still howled through the alley, and Dusty couldn't help but feel that something beyond his control had intervened. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but one thing was certain. He wasn't alone in this fight. As he disappeared into the night, the prayers of others followed him, unseen but felt, pushing him forward toward the final confrontation that awaited him.